Okay, now we're recording. Good evening and welcome everyone to another class of the biblical prophets. This is the book of Samuel, and we are beginning a new book. We're going to give a little review of the previous book. The book was Shoftim, the Judges, and it is a sad story. It was a tragic story. You know, we had certain heroes, a few good stories, but then a lot of sadness, a lot of loss, a lot of sinning. And it ends in a terrible, terrible way. How does it end? If we remember, it kept saying, in those days, everyone did whatever they wanted. In those days, there was no king in Israel, so everybody basically chose what they thought was right for them. And even the judges were doing what they thought was right for them, as opposed to what was right according to the Torah. Even the judges were following in ways that were not ideal and ended up leading to idolatry, maybe, and ended up leading to enmity, like hatred between the tribes, and even bloodshed. And we end up with a really terrible situation where the tribes all fight against each other and cause pretty much a civil war. And, you know, at the end of the book of Shoftim, it gets a little bit better that they allow the tribe of Binyamin to come back so that they don't become extinct entirely. But there's a feeling of uneasiness. There's a feeling that we are at a bit of a loss. Even though there is the temple, and even though there is the priest, and the temple with the priest should be enough to guide the people, nevertheless, apparently that's not enough. And that the moral breakdown leads to a social breakdown. The moral breakdown is that they stop following God's laws. The social breakdown is that they start fighting with each other. That's what we saw to the point where we get the last story of the book of Shoftim is the Pilegesh Begiv'ah, a terrible story of the concubine that was so mistreated and so hurt and terrorized that when she died, they cut her the pieces into 12 pieces and say, this is the fault of the 12 tribes of Israel. You see, when the Israelites are united, then nothing like this would ever happen. That's the message that the rabbis want to leave us with, or the rabbis, the writers of the book of Shoftim, which we say is Shmuel. Now we begin a new book. The book is Shmuel. Shmuel is divided into two sections, Shmuel Aleph and Shmuel Bet. And this story is completely different from what we were used to. It starts in a very interesting kind of long, drawn-out story about one couple and their travails and their issues that they deal with. And what happens to that, you know, that they're the origin for the story of the prophet Samuel, who becomes the protagonist. The book has his name, and he becomes the great prophet of Israel. I would say, and the Jewish prayers corroborate, that Moses is number one, Samuel is number two. Okay, on some levels, they considered Moses and Samuel to be equals. It's just that they were in different generations. So Samuel becomes a very, very important prophet and a very important leader. And he is that strong leader that we're looking for, who's going to unite the nations once again. But we'll ask ourselves, is that going to be enough? Remember, Yoshua was strong enough. He was a leader. He wasn't a king. He was a leader. He was strong enough. But when he dies, his children aren't able to do it. Even the leaders of Judah aren't able to do it. The priest who is in the temple isn't able to do it. No one can unite the people. And their people seem to say there's only one person who can unite us, and that's a king. But this story is not about a king. This story is about a prophet. The story begins in Samuel 1. There was a man from Ramatayim Tzofim, from Har Ephraim, and his name was Elkanah, the son of Yeroham Elihu Tohu Tzuf Ephrati. He was from Ephraim. It tells us his whole lineage. And he had two wives. One wife was Chana, or Chana, and one wife was Pnina. Now, we're familiar with a man with two wives from, of course, the story of Yaakov and Rachel and Leah. And we know it doesn't end well. And we wonder if the story here is being told to us that has a similar kind of resonance. What happens when you have two wives? There's going to be enmity, there's going to be hatred there's going to be jealousy between the two. And that is how we also learn another very important piece of information, which was so critical in those days. Pnina had children, but Chana did not. So you can imagine over years and years, it says children, right? So at least they're married several years for Pnina to have children, whereas for Chana to have nothing all during that time. Now, this is exactly along the story of Yaakov, Rachel, and Leah, as we'll learn. In verse 3, this man would go from his town every year to worship and to offer sacrifices in Shiloh. Finally, the Tanakh mentions Shiloh. What is Shiloh? Well, Shiloh is the place where the Mikdash, the Mishkan, is located. How long is the Mishkan located in Shiloh? 369 years. So Shiloh is a very, very important place. And it stands to reason that during the time of the Shoftim, Shiloh was also the place, but no one from the time of the Shoftim mentioned it. So we have a weird situation during the previous generation where there was the priest, there was the temple, there was a place that you can go to seek God, and no one did. Now this is a different story. It's saying, what happens if you do? Elkanah seems like a good man from Ephraim, goes once a year to offer his sacrifices, to meet the high priest. His name is Eli. And Eli was a little old, so his two sons, Chofni and Pinchas, were the priests. Now, in ancient times, the priests were the ones who administer your sacrifices, the ones who would offer you penance, would offer you atonement, the ones who would take care of you, and you would take care of him. There was a very strong and close relationship you had with the priest. So it seems like it's starting in a very good way. You know, Elkanah goes to offer sacrifices. Verse 4, on one such day, Elkanah offers a sacrifice, and he gave a portion to his wife and to his sons and daughters. He gave a portion of the sacrifice. You know, you go there, and some of the sacrifices are totally to God, and some of the sacrifices you share, okay, with the priests. Okay, those are called shlamim. And therefore, he comes back and he brings a portion of the shlamim or the sacrifice to his wife and children. But then he gives his other wife Chana double portion. Why? Because Chana he loved, and she was barren, or it says and God closed her womb. Now, the question is, Does he love Hannah because she doesn't, is that love really mercy, pity? Like, my poor wife doesn't have children and therefore I will, give her a double portion? Or does he love her more than the other wife and wants to give her a double portion simply because he loves her? And the fact is that she doesn't have children. By the way, there's a verse in the Torah that you're not allowed to give a double portion to the wife that you love more if she's not produced, if she hasn't produced the eldest child. But here it doesn't make a difference because she hasn't produced any child. He's just giving her a double portion because the Tanakh is saying that he wanted to show her how much he loved her. However, verse 6 tells us, there seemed to be some jealousy between the two sisters. I'm sorry, the two wives. Does not say that they are sisters. The two wives. And the wife with the children would make fun of the other one. And this was what happened all the time, year after year. Elkanah would go and bring sacrifices and then bring back the sacrifices and give more to Hannah. But Hannah didn't seem to be too pleased with it after all. She doesn't have a child. And Penina always reminded her of that fact. You don't have a child. Well, the Tanakh tells us that she would never eat of those portions. In other words, she was so angry at the situation that she didn't eat a thing. So now listen to verse 8. This tells us a little bit about Elkanah and his relationship with Hannah. Elkanah, her husband, says, "Why are you crying, Hannah? Why aren't you eating? And why is your heart so pained, so saddened? Am I not better for you than 10 sons?" What a fascinating question. The implication, of course, is that Hannah has Elkanah's love. She just doesn't have Elkanah's seed. She doesn't have a child. So Elkanah says, well, isn't my love more important than 10 children? And what is Hannah's answer? Of course, there's no specific answer. She doesn't say yes or no, but the implication is, the answer is no. So great was the desire for having a child, bearing a child. It was a status symbol. It was a mission. It was a fulfillment of God's law. It was establishing your home. It was having someone who would take care of you. It was fighting and combating the loneliness. So no, he is not better than 10 sons. So what does she do? Vatakom Chana, she gets up after she ate and after she drank. So you see that she did do something, okay? And she goes to visit Shiloh. In other words, generally, the man goes to the temple and the woman stays home. But Hannah didn't want to have any of it. Hannah changes the paradigm. She introduces to us that if you want something and you're a woman and it's thousands of years ago, you get up and you go do it. If you need something, you don't wait for your husband. Hannah teaches us such important fundamental principles in Judaism. And one of the things she teaches us is to pray. The Talmud teaches us that we learn prayer from Hannah. Private prayer we learn from Hannah. So if you read, where's Eli? Eli HaKohen is sitting on the ledge or the doorway to the temple of God. Okay? And who does he see? He sees a woman. She is by the doorway or near there. It doesn't exactly say where. But you can see her, verse 10, that she is marat nefesh. Marat nefesh means her soul is bitter. Your soul is bitter when you're in a sad state, when you're filled with despair. So Hannah is standing there, reflecting that her soul is suffering. And what is she doing? Vatitpalel al Hashem uvachot tivke. She is praying on God. She's praying to the Lord, and she's crying. Now, you might say this is the most natural thing in the world, but remember, in ancient times, there was no general congregational communal prayer. That didn't exist. People talk to God. People have a private moment when thought to God. Yes, but that she should go and say, I'm going to pray to God, novel idea. So novel that Eli didn't know what she was doing. She was crying. Her eyes were closed and her lips were moving. And Eli wondered what's going on here. But what was she actually doing? Verse 11. Vatidor neder. She makes a vow. Now remember, vows in ancient times were very, very serious things. You fulfilled your vows. If you didn't, then God is going to repay you in a dangerous way. You fulfilled your vows in ancient times. And therefore, she's making a vow. Who else made a vow? Jacob made a vow, if you recall. So Hannah makes a vow, and she says, Imra'o to God, Imra'o tir'eh bani amatecha. If you see, God, if you see me, if you see your servant, your maidservant, in other words, see me, uzchartani, and remember me, and don't forget me, then and you give me seed, you give me a child, I will give him back to you his entire lifetime. And a blade will never go on his head. Now, what does that mean? In the Torah, there is a concept called a Nazir. A Nazir is someone who never shaves his head, never touches wine, never touches impurity. He's basically all purity, all holiness. But that usually is for a specific time period, 30 days, 6 weeks, a month, a year, but not more than that. It's not forever. But there is another type of Nazir, a Nazir mibeten, a Nazir from the womb. That if you say that my child is a Nazir before he is born or she is born, they're Nazir forever. Which is basically Hannah saying, I want this child so much that I'm willing to give him up. That's crazy. That's counterintuitive. If you want the child so much, that means that you want him. You want to take care of him. You want to hold on to him. And Hannah says, no, I want him so badly to be in this world that I'm willing to set him free or to give him up to the temple. And that will be the greatest gift to me, that I can give him to God. Interesting. We generally in Torah and Judaism, we don't give our children to God in the sense of sacrificing, but we can give our children to God in the sense of letting them become holy people and be completely enmeshed in the house of God. So Hannah says, that is my vow. Now look what happens in verse 12. She's praying a lot, and Eli is watching her mouth. And Hannah is speaking, she's kind of speaking internally. She's speaking in her soul. So she's not talking out loud. She's just moving her lips and swaying maybe and crying. And Eli thinks she is a drunk. Which is very sad because Eli is supposed to be the priest who sees things, who knows things, and yet he doesn't see her properly. Now, this is also a statement about Eli, that he's basically a little too old. He's been there for a long, long time, and he's not able to see that this woman is very, very holy. So he says to her, and he yells at her, and he says disparagingly, "How long are you going to be drunk for? Get that wine away from you." And she responds and says, "No, my master, I am not drunk. I'm a bitter woman. I've not had wine or beer. I'm simply pouring out my soul before God." It's a beautiful expression that is used throughout Jewish ritual. Ve'eshpoch et nafshi lifnei Hashem. I pour out my soul to God. Please, Hannah says to Eli, don't let your maidservant, me, be in distress or be affected by the evil ones. But I'm so angry or upset or saddened that's why I'm speaking here so long. In other words, it was highly, highly unusual for a woman to be standing there. And it was unheard of that she should be praying to God, and unheard of that she should be vowing to God. And therefore, Eli thought she was a drunk. And Hannah has to explain in the humblest ways that I'm not drunk. I'm simply heartbroken. And I needed to do something in order to deal with this sadness. So I came to God. I came to pray. Now Eli, who missed it from the beginning, finally he gets it. And he says to her in verse 17, "Go in peace. And the God of Israel will respond to you and answer your call and your request that you need." Sounds like Eli had a moment of clarity, and he understood that this person is pouring out her heart, and God will respond to her. So she said, "Thank you. Your maidservant is very happy that you gave that response." And she wasn't upset anymore, because once Eli said that in the name of God, so that she knew it was going to be true. So Elkanah the next day, in true biblical fashion, knows his wife Hannah, and she becomes pregnant. God remembers her, and in the proper time, she becomes pregnant, and she has a child. And she says, "I will call him Shmuel, for from God I have borrowed him." Shemiel, from the Lord I have I have borrowed him. In other words, right from the start, he's saying, this does not belong to me. This child belongs to God. So Elkanah was very excited. And he says, "Let's go bring the child to the Lord, offer sacrifices, fulfill our promises." And Hannah says he's not ready. We wait, generally it's 3 years, we wait a certain amount for the child to be weaned, the child to be at a certain age that the child can, act on his own, is not like helpless. So she waits. and she nurses her child, and finally they go together and they bring all these sacrifices, and they stand before Eli. Now remember, this is years from the last incident where Eli almost threw her out and finally blessed her. And she says to Eli, I'm the woman who stood before you years ago, praying at this spot, praying to God. El anar hazeh hitpalalti, for this child, and she shows him Shmuel. For this child I prayed to God, and God answered my request, my petition. And I, in the same moment, made a vow and fulfilled my vow that I will give him back to the Lord. He doesn't even belong to me. I will give him back to the Lord, and here he is. Wow. Hannah is overjoyed. And she recites a poem. And we know that when you recite a poem, it's when you sing a song, okay, words aren't enough. You need to sing it. You need to be excited about it. You need to, join in on melody and she's simply expressing the storm of emotions that she's going through, the joy and the gratitude and the feelings of having a child and then giving the child away and then giving the child to the temple and everything that goes into it. She's so excited about. And therefore she calls out and she said, Alatz libi ba'Hashem ramak karni ba'Hashem rachava pi aloivai ki samachti b'yeshuatecha. I've triumphed, but I've triumphed for God. And there is no one like God who delivers. And do not speak, in such lofty ways about your pride, for God knows all. In verse 6, God, he deals with death. He deals death and he gives life. He casts people down and he brings people back up. He brings the great ones, the princes down, and he belittles them, and he makes paupers into rich people. God does that in an instant. Speak to anyone who wins the lottery, and they, their life changes in an instant, and vice versa, about a stock exchange and whatnot. And Hannah continues and says, these beautiful, beautiful prayer, 10 verses of how wonderful God is and how God guards the steps of its faithful. But the wicked ones better be careful, because they will perish. And once she finishes singing this song in the temple, I guess after eating and after participating in the sacrifices, she goes home. But she leaves her child there. Can you imagine what that feeling was like, knowing that this is the last moment she has as a mother for this child, but it's time for her to leave this child alone. But she's okay with that. Why is she okay with it? Because she's leaving it in the house of God, under the capable hands of Eli. Well, not exactly under the capable hands of Eli, because he was rather old. He was old years ago. So he's not really in charge. Who's in charge? His sons, Chofni and Pinchas. Well, who are they? How are they doing? Let's look at the next verse. Verse 12. Now Eli's sons were scoundrels. They paid no heed to the Lord. Can you imagine the drama? Hannah doesn't even know this. Maybe she did, but the drama here, she does everything in her life to have this one child that she's going to place in the care of the priests of the temple, who will guard over him, rear him, develop him, create this child, develop him to what he's supposed to be, and lo and behold, who does he leave him with? 2 scoundrels, Chofni and Pinchas. Let's see how they were scoundrels. Verse 13. This is how the priest used to deal with the people. When anyone brought a sacrifice, the priest's boy would come along with a fork and with the meat that was boiling, and he would thrust it into the kettle, the great pot, the small pot, and whatever the fork brought up, the priest would take away on it. That was the practice in Shiloh with all the Israelites who came there. Basically, remember, the priests need to eat part of the sacrifice, part of the food that they were being sacrificed. But now, even before it was turned into smoke, the priest's boy would come and say to the man who was sacrificing, hand over some meat to roast for the priest, for he won't accept boiled meat from you, only raw. And if the man said, let him turn to the sweat into the smoke and then take as much as you want, he said, no, hand it over now or I'll take it by force. Who this young man? Unfortunately, this is the sons of Eli. Eli, Chafni and Pinchas, they were not such ideal people. They were not morally righteous. They were basically corrupt. They were kind of, taking money. They were taking the food. They were doing some other things according to the Talmud as well. So that's a very, very sad situation that we have this child. Let's say, I don't know, is he 5 years old? Is he 8 years old? Is he, he's a child, but he is put in a terrible, terrible situation. Why? First, it tells us, by the way, you should know, verse 18, that Samuel was there serving. He was serving, but these people were all around him. He was obviously going to be influenced terribly. And his mother made him, used to visit him and bring him clothes. And verse 20, very nice story. God blesses Elkanah and his wife, Hannah, and Hannah then goes and has 3 more sons and 2 more daughters. And Shmuel is in the house of God, growing up and becoming a man. But in verse 22, Eli is very old. And he hears what his sons are doing and how they are bedding the women. Can you imagine the priest's sons, the holiest people in Israel at the time, are sleeping with these women? I mean, the women are coming for sacrifices. The women are coming for specific things that they need. And they're kind of blackmailing these women. Terrible. So what is Eli? And Eli is a good person, but what happens if you're a good person and you say yes too often? Your kids don't take you seriously. So what happens is, in verse 24, he says, 23, why are you doing these terrible things that I hear? Please, my sons, don't do this. It's not good to go away from God. If a person sins against God, don't you think that there's going to be a comeuppance? There's going to, you're going to be punished. Why would you do such a thing? So, unfortunately, they didn't listen to their father. Now, at the same time that this is going on, Shmuel is growing up, developing, rising, and being very good with God and good with people, but the sons who are in charge, they're scoundrels. So much so that a man of God comes to Eli and delivers a message from God. Says, this I need from your sons, that they're like embarrassing me. They're taking these sacrifices and God is not interested in your sacrifices if you're a horrible person. Therefore, God says, your sons are going to be punished. You're going to be punished. You're going to be punished as well. I am going to have to, verse 31, a time will coming when I am going to break your power and that of your father's house, and you will be no longer the elder in your house. Unfortunately, You will die as an ordinary man, but this is the sign. Your children, Chafni and Pinchas, are going to die on the same day. And I will raise up myself a faithful priest who will act in accordance with my wishes and build him an enduring house. And all the survivors of your house shall come and bow low for him for the sake of money, fee, and a loaf of bread, and say, please give me something to eat. So this ends in a very, very sad way for the specific, as the sun is setting for Eli, an old generation Eli who might have done well, but his time has come and he did not educate his children. The sun is rising for Shmuel. And this dichotomy is presented in these first chapters. The mother who dotes over her son, who's willing to give up her son, who's willing to do everything for her child, and her child is going to grow up, and his child is going to not be influenced by the negative forces. Whereas Eli, the old standard, been around for ages, he and his children are ultimately going to end up in demise. This then ends chapter 2, and please stay in touch for the next lectures in the saga of what happens with Samuel and the book of Shmuel. Have a good night.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you very much.